Welcome to the afternoon, two afternoon sessions of ratification of the Constitution. This morning it was the indoors debate in which we looked at the whole picture with the table and then an in-depth study, particularly of Massachusetts and Virginia. This afternoon we want to look at the out-of-doors debate. And the first way in which I'd like to introduce the out-of-doors debate to you is to look at the Federalist Papers, the outline of the Federalist Papers, and chat very briefly about how these papers came into being and sort of how to have a quickish read and a guide over the Federalist Papers. I don't know if it's in the introduction. Is it we were talking about that a lot. Is that it? The design. It's the design. That's it. Okay. Once upon a time, there was no such thing as the Federalist Papers. What they were opinion editorial pieces and written under the name Publius. Hamilton started these writings, but under the name of Caesar, which led immediately to an opposition member writing under the name of Brutus. Madison came along and told the imprudent Hamilton to change his name. And the name was changed from Caesar, who was well known as a tyrant, killed by Brutus, to Publius, who had the reputation of being a savior. And these pseudonyms and Roman pseudonyms are sort of very interesting. Why a pseudonym? Well, there's a low ground and a high ground. The low ground is, I don't want you to know who I am. All the better to fool you, my dear. The high ground is, I want you to take a look at my argument, not do an ad hominem. Ad hominem is, if I know who said it, then I don't need to know who read it, what you said, because I can infer from that that you're no good or you're good, etc. So the high ground is, I want you to focus on the argument, not who it is who is writing. Why Roman? Because in many, many ways, I think the backdrop for the American Republic is built, the word republic, by the way, is a Roman word. They tended not to use the word democracy, which is a Greek word. Krasi by the demos in its original meaning meant krasi, rule, demos, the many who are poor and stupid, is what its original meaning was. And so who in their right? See, we're too politically correct now that even if I were to say the many who are poor and stupid, one goes like this, it's like you can't say that. Oh, I'm not saying it, actually, I'm just giving you the etymological root of the meaning of the word. So who in their right mind for 2,000 years, until you change the meaning of the word democracy, would be in favor of direct democracy, rule on the spot by those who were many, poor, and stupid. The only way to make democracy work is by making it ruled by the many who are not poor and not stupid. So therefore you could defend it. Okay, now I've totally lost where I was. Oh yes, the Roman names. The Roman names. Building Rome anew. Athens was not the model for the framers. Rome was the model. If you're interested in Athens, you'd go there for thought. You'd go there for Plato and for Socrates, and that's where you might find your thinkers. But if you wanted to go and emulate, excuse me, or learn from doers, you go to Rome. Cato, etc. George Washington read about Cato regularly. So the Roman model is the Roman Empire, the Roman Senate, the Roman buildings with their temples and their pillars. So the use of pseudonyms, both low ground and high ground, was widespread. So these editorials appearing in the New York Journal and then distributed up and down the coast, were called essays of the Federalists, and they wrote a number of them. In Federalist number 1, there's an outline which indicates what the challenge is and how they were going to go about it. The challenge is a typical kind of an American challenge, which we're very, very used to. This is the moment in history when the fundamental choice has to be made. Nobody has faced this before, and no one will face it after. We are the people to make the decision, and the world will stand or fall as a result of our decision. That's Federalist number 1, paragraph number 1. Goes on to say we're going to talk about a number of things in these essays, but we don't know how many, because we don't know how pesky the opposition is. So the way to read the way to read this debate is that the anti-Federalists, the opposition, criticize the Constitution, and the Federalists criticize the anti-Federalist. So the anti-Federalist literature came first. If you want, there's a timeline on there. You can see the timeline. The Federalist doesn't come out until October, by which time the anti-Federalists are pumping these opposition's pamphlets out against the Constitution. Don't ratify, don't ratify. There's going to be danger. The court will become supreme. The presidency will become like a king. The states will be flushed down the Mississippi, Potomac, whatever. But there's danger that lieth ahead, and crisis is around the corner, if not upon us already. And so the Federalist has to answer these criticisms, both weird and solid. And they don't come out until October. And they're all written from New York. But they indicate in Federalist number 1, the authors, these joint authors, indicate we're going to cover a number of topics. But we don't know how many papers we're going to devote to it. It turns out that as we read through these essays, we learn how many. So that Federalist 2 through Federalist 14 considers something called the utility of the Union. That is, the Union itself is somewhat sacred. The Union is useful. It doesn't simply mean usefulness in the way in which we usually use the word useful. Oh, that's useful. It means it's a higher meaning. When they use the word inconvenience, they mean it's terrible. So one has to be careful about how words were used then over against words being used now. The usefulness of the Union means essentially the essential. Keeping together is absolutely vital. Falling apart will lead us into considerable trouble. It will bring Europe to America. Look at Europe. You have all these petty states quarreling and killing each other across the European landscape. The promise of America is to avoid those kinds of war between France and Germany and Switzerland and Austria and the rest of the country, so that we can have a new world. And the new world is where we can trade and compete with each other, but instead of killing each other and having celebrations about it 600 years later and still quarreling about 1066 and whatnot. So the utility of the Union. It's within that section, utility of the Union, and we will look at this in a moment. By the way, the general title of this third session is The Constitution and Human Nature. And I thought, as a way of getting into that, because a couple of people have asked me, but how do you read the Federalist? So I'm giving you a design, how to read the Federalist, and to look at the human nature question within that design. We will want to, in a few moments, take a look at Federalist 10. Or not just yet, but Federalist 10 is often looked upon as the most important Federalist paper. And to be sure, it tells us an incredible amount of about human nature and the link between the understanding of human nature and why you want a constitution and what kind of constitution you want. But that's the location of Federalist 10, which means that whatever Federalist 10 means, the context is that human nature being what it is, we are likely to be quarrelsome and contentious with each other. Thus, we need a kind of union which is thoroughly aware of that contentious nature that we have and manages to control it or quell it or provide us some room whereby we can be quarrelsome with each other but not killing each other. The European model is not the model. So what kind of union? I mean, Europe is still arguing about what kind of union you're going to have. A European Union? Do you join the Union? Does everything run from Brussels? So that the question of being together is linked to the issue of being apart and killing each other. So that's why Federalist 10 falls in this section. Federalist 10 is about faction. Faction is about killing each other, not liking each other. Union is about trying to solve that problem in some way, a certain kind of union. The utility, the absolute necessity of a certain kind of union to control the factious part of our human nature. Federalist 15 comes along and tells us, we've just spent the foregoing essays talking about union. It's time to talk about something else. So we now know that there's something else, and that is the minimum energetic government requirement. The anti-federalists would argue that the Constitution creates the potentiality for a strong central government that will flush the states down the Potomac. So Hamilton virtually writes all of these essays. And his response is, if you think that the Constitution has the potentiality to be too strong and too consolidated, let me tell you, it only meets minimum standards. Whose standards? My standards. What are your standards? Strength, vitality, getting things done, or as John F. Kennedy would say, vigor. What you want, anti-federalists, is some kind of weak, decentralized government that can't get anything done. So let me tell you, if you're scared about the potentiality of the Constitution, and now I'm putting words in Hamilton's mouth, but he's not here to defend himself, is that if you're scared now in 1787, 1788, about the potentiality of this Constitution to do some extensive things, just wait until I'm Secretary of State. And then you'll really see what is possible. That's how I read this, that the Constitution meets the minimum standards, and as soon as I get into office, I'll raise those standards. And we'll have a quarrel. And sure enough, you have a quarrel between Jefferson and Hamilton on the one side, etc., and Washington listening to the two of them over strict construction versus loose construction. Part 4, we know that Hamilton's done with what he has to do with that question. So, because we now turn to could you go back up? The minimum. What was the one before? Oh, the insufficiency of the articles. Don't try to reform the articles. We need to scratch them. So radicalism is going to the root. The Constitution tries to remove the real core of the problem of the articles. What is the core of the problem of the articles? It can't move unless everyone agrees. And then, well, so what is the solution? The Constitution is the solution. But if you're scared of the Constitution, then let me tell you, you're only meeting the minimum standards. We need to go even further. When Federalist 37 comes, we learn that we're off to a new start. Which means, in practice, what happens? From October to January, these first 36 are written. And then the editor decides, of this newspaper, decides, you know what? This is too important to let go by. People do not, this is my interpretation, people do not save newspapers. They may bundle them and throw them out each week in the recycling. But people hardly ever throw away a book. So why don't we take these 36 essays, which have been in the op-ed page of a newspaper, and bundle them together and put it in a book, and call it Federalist Papers Volume 1. That's how the Federalist Papers were born. Issued as still part of the campaign. But the nature of the purpose and the audience starts changing from essays written clearly to persuade an existing electorate. 2, essays collected together and bundled together for the next generation so the next generation can understand. So that's what we read. It's been so successful that, in fact, if we want to understand the founding, and you only have a small amount of time and material that you can devote to it, you don't go through the Constitutional Convention, hardly. You don't go through what we went through this morning. You go through the Federalist. Such is its status. So 37 actually starts a new beginning. And this now is a run by Madison from 37 all the way to 51. And Madison starts this new beginning. So volume 1 is out in the press. They're continuing to write these op-ed pieces. But this is Madison's riff right now. And first of all, he writes, why it's so difficult to draw lines. And we'll talk a bit more about that in the next session. That is, how do I draw the line between what is general government's role and the state governments? How do I draw the line between what Congress should do, what the president should do, what the judiciary should do? How difficult is it to do that? So founding a government is a difficult task. I want your sympathy, audience. So now, by the way, Federalist 37 comes out at exactly the time the Massachusetts Convention is meeting. It is more than just simply accident that Madison now addresses the entire difficulty of what it means to write a constitution. The Constitution itself and the framers themselves are under scrutiny in Massachusetts. 41 through 46, Madison talks about the difficulty of drawing a line to keep the states in clout, in power. 47 through 51, he talks about the difficulties of republicanism. And he ends this riff in Federalist 51. We're talking about the great difficulty of founding itself. I mean, the whole nature of the enterprise. And he's correct. Never before in the history of the world has been a founding by multiple founders. It's been Moses, or Theseus, or Cyrus, or one person who hasn't had to deal with anybody else, chop them into bits if they disagree, call God's wrath on you if you disagree, or whatever. This is the first time a deliberative founding has been created. Thus, it's very, very difficult. What's also difficult, he ends on this note, also difficult is you're trying to provide a constitution where humans are in ultimate control and human beings are not angels. How do you do that? With great difficulty. So this session, what I want us to focus on is Federalist 10, which introduces the notion that faction, division, disunion is sown in the nature of man. And secondly, that it is Federalist 51, it is extremely difficult to form a government where humans are ruling humans, when human nature is fallen. So those are the two essays and how they fit in. Let me just move on for slightly to show you where we're going to go this afternoon. The next part is 52 through 84. The true principles of Republican government. This can be broken down into the following. 52 through 61 deals with the House of Representatives. What is the point to having a House of Representatives? How can I tell a good house from a bad house? 62 through 66, the Senate. What is the point in having a Senate? How can I tell a difference between a good Senate and a bad Senate? 67 through 77, the presidency. What is the point of the presidency? How can I tell a good presidency from a bad presidency? 78 through 82, the judiciary. What is the point in having a judiciary? How can I tell the difference between a good judiciary and a bad judiciary? Federalist 83 through 84, we're wrapping up the show. 5 miscellaneous issues, including why we don't need a Bill of Rights. So that's the design of the Federalist. What I want to do in a session together right now is focus on 10 and 51. What I want to do this afternoon is to talk more about the separation of powers and the relationship of the branches and the states, namely the institutions. All right. Let's go then to another feature of this website, which emphasizes what I would call the essential Federalists. You see there are 84. I don't expect you to have the chance, either as citizen, student, or teacher, to have the chance to read all 84. I wish you would. It is one of America's finest pieces of literature. And to say, well, of course it wasn't written in an ivory tower. It's political literature, but that doesn't diminish its importance. It's literature for a democratic republic. If we were to look at the essential Federalist Papers, what I've done is, I know you'd only like to see about 3, but out of the 84, I've been pushed to come up with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Of course, if you push me even further, what I would do would be 9, 10, 51, 63, 71 and 78. I mean, so I can get it down to, I can get it down even further. All right, but let's leave it at 13 for the moment, which covers both human nature and institutions. And this is what we're going to be looking at for the rest of the day, essentially. Okay. What I have done with each of these, so let's just go straight to number 10, November the 22nd. There are 20, all right, bear with me. This is how I try to teach students and teachers and citizens how to come to grips with the Federalist Papers. For us today, it seems rather difficult to grasp. The language seems so convoluted, the tone, the level seems so difficult, but I'm trying to resist the temptation to put it in contemporary language. We should work to understand them. They shouldn't work to understand us. Right? They don't need to learn anything from us. We need to learn from them. Okay. So, what I've done, not as a substitution, but to join you and the framers together, is I provided a paragraph by paragraph summary of each of the paragraphs of Federalist 10 in order to encourage you not to get lost, not to give up, but to say, all right, here is the main point to this first paragraph. Why the paragraph? Because that is the unit by which writers, particularly in those days, wrote. That paragraphs mattered. There are 23. I'm not going to say, therefore, number 12 is the most important. I'm not going to get into numerology. What I am going to say is that the paragraph is the unit, and don't leave a paragraph until you understand it. But it's too difficult. Well, read it again. Well, read it again. Read it again. I was once asked by a student, and I made a wild guess, a student at Pepperdine, said, can you tell me how to read the Federalist? I said, read it. I said, take it, break it down, such and such, look at it, make sure you don't go to the next paragraph until you've read this one. And she says, but it's so difficult. I took a gamble. I said, you're religious, aren't you? She said, yes. I said, well, could you please teach me how to read the Gospels? Is there a Cliff Notes to read the Gospels? Is that what you... No, you don't want to do that. I said, well, what should I do? Read it. I said, thank you. Go for it. Read it. There is no substitute for suffering. And one of the crazy things about America, we will transform you. And it'll only take you 2.5 minutes. Just, no. A, transformation is not the point of education, and 2, it cannot be done in 2.5 minutes. It's a come on to say that. What we want to take a look at is paragraph number, let's see, all right, now, paragraph number 7. The latent causes of faction are thus sown in the nature of men. What Madison is saying is that the reasons why regimes collapse, and every single regime in the history of the world has collapsed. That's hard to stomach. Every regime, and in our own lifetime, The Soviet Union has collapsed, only to rise again. Every regime has collapsed. The British Empire has collapsed. Okay? What makes us think that the American experiment, which is an experiment in non-collapsing, won't collapse? We have to figure out then, what is it that makes regime, that encourages, inclines regimes to collapse? Well, think about it. What is it that inclines us to collapse? We come into being and die. Why? Because we wear out. Some of us die early. Some commit suicide. Some are invaded by others and killed. Some of us have heart problems. Some of us have other problems. But we die. Madison's claim is, why must that happen to regimes or political institutions? Why must they? Why must that happen? We are going to be the first people in the history of the world to try to solve that problem. That's the American claim. Arrogance, perhaps, but uniqueness, definitely. All right, if that's the case, let's get to the bottom of this. Why do regimes collapse? The idea, and for Madison, they collapse because of internal dissension to the point where we do not like each other. Imagine the nastiest divorce that you could possibly imagine. At one time you're friends, and the next time you're enemies. And who knows you better than your enemy? No one, not even including yourself. Civil war is the worst thing. Divorce is similar to civil war. What is civil war about? When brother and sister kill each other. They cannot stand them on the same part of the earth. That's the problem. What causes that? Human nature. That's what Madison's claim is. Why? Because we are inclined to be, if not watched, we're inclined to be naughty. Very naughty. We tend to group with other people of naughty inclinations and say, because we are white and you are black, we're going to enslave you. Because we are Protestants and you are Catholic, we are going to protest, and you won't even know when we stop protesting. Because us Protestants, we Protestants will protest against ourselves. And we'll continue. You are Jewish and I am Muslim. I want you off the face of the earth. In other words, what Madison is getting at is, don't just use your imagination. Look around. There are clans, there are tribes, there are groups who gather together and are not by nature tolerant or respectful of each other. Human beings have to be taught or channeled to be tolerant and respectful. They are not so by nature. All right, and that's a huge, huge claim. Faction is sown in the nature of man. What is faction? Where a group has common opinions, passions, and interests which are so adverse to another group's opinions, passions, and interests that we cannot live together in the same house, same neighborhood, or even same country, or perhaps in the same world. What do we do about it? Madison says, well, excuse me, we could try to get rid of faction. How do you get rid of faction? Give everybody the same opinion, passion, and interest. Therefore, we'll have no division. Well, what do we divide over? Well, one point is religion. So we've seen it. People still quarrel to the point of crusades and killing each other over religion. So Madison's point is there a way in which we can get the benefits of religion? Love thy neighbor, obey the law, don't commit adultery, that kind of thing. Without getting this nasty side, I'll kill you, I want you face off the earth, you'll go to hell. Is there a way in which we can do that? And he says, very interestingly, by having competition among religions, Federalist 51. That is, the way in which you secure religious liberty is by avoiding religious monopoly. So that if I become attached to a certain religion, it shall not become the state-based established religion. So that somehow I want to create a situation where the fact that you're an American Baptist and I'm a Southern Baptist, we can go our own way without killing each other or being so quarrelsome and contentious. Toleration or respect doesn't just happen. It has to be, human nature has to be channeled in some fashion, that we also develop different attachments than simply religion. I mean, that's Madison's brilliance. We could eliminate it by having one religion, established religion. If everybody became Catholic, hardly likely that anybody, if everybody became Muslim, but then what we'd have to do is to settle the difference between the Shiites and the Sunnis. But if everybody became Hindu, then we'd have to settle that, etc., etc. But if it were possible to have one religion and everybody agreed to it, we wouldn't have religious differences or religious faction. Marx's answer is, do away with religion. So if you do away with religion, you won't have any religious wars. Madison's point is, have religious competition. That way you secure the benefits of religion, and then somehow, for Madison, human beings competing with each other leads not to chaos, not to war, but to equilibrium. I mean, that's sort of like, if I may say so, a market-based solution to religious quarrels. And that sounds a bit crass, but that would how it would fit in, say, with a libertarian model today. You just have a market-based solution so that we don't kill each other, and yet we can all enjoy our own thing. But that requires respect or toleration or space in order for this to happen. So what are we left with, says Madison, if we're not going to get rid of, he says, well, look, it is impossible and indefensible in a way, impractical, to give everybody the same religion, and unwise to get rid of religion altogether. So what do we do? I mean, why is it unwise? Because you have to get rid of liberty. There's your point. We could all make you conform. We can produce an orthodoxy. There's an orthodoxy on the right, which we've known for ages. There's an orthodoxy on the left, which we've now been introduced to over the last 10, 15 years. And the orthodoxy on the left is, you can see it coming at Santa Barbara, that I'm not supposed to be able to say anything that might, that's the operative word, might hurt your feelings. And I'm supposed to, if I were teaching at Santa Barbara and this thing goes through, I'm supposed to produce a syllabus which indicates checkpoints. This material you might be offensive. This material you might find to be potentially post-traumatizing. I mean, it's still in the stage where we can smile at it, but I'm suggesting that there is, both on the right and the left, a certain orthodoxy which solves the problem of faction. Namely, we don't have a difference of opinion. Why not? Because we all agree, either through force or through an agreement, that this is who we are. But haven't you given up liberty? The answer is yes. Which means that for certain people, there's something more important than liberty. But not for Madison. Which means he is not going to eliminate faction. Which means you're going to have to work with human nature rather than transform human nature. How do you work with human nature? You try to control the effects of faction. How do you control the effects of faction? Well, how do you control crime? Keep the lights on, put the police on the beat, such and such. You probably never will be able to eliminate crime. But you do certain crime control. So you do certain faction control. You have a multiplicity of opinions, a multiplicity of interests, freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of such and such, and so you have competition again. Madison relies on the competitive nature of human beings to solve the problem of human beings. But that's a big statement which is clearly can come under attack and opposition. That is, aren't you in fact encouraging human beings to be selfish and then relying on selfishness, fighting selfishness to provide goodness? I mean, how does that happen? Well, how does the market work? How do you get equilibrium out of people competing? And how does the paper get delivered every morning? Pretty much the same time. How does that happen? Do you need planners to do that? I don't know, but that's Madison's point. If we move now, so his point is create a commercial republic of large size with competing interests, and you will probably be able to control faction. And you haven't transformed human nature. If we look to Federalist 51, I have provided there in 51 There are 10 paragraphs in Federalist 51. And what I have done is to provide a paragraph by paragraph breakdown in Federalist 51. All right, 4B. He says, we must make ambition counteract ambition. In other words, what do we want to avoid here? In Federalist 10, he wants to avoid a monopoly of religion. He wants to avoid a monopoly of economic power. Here he wants to avoid a monopoly or concentration of political power. So which means, as we'll go into the next session, he wants the branches of government to compete with each other. So that a president will be in love with his office, her office, and have such ambition for glory or honor that he will compete with the Congress. And the members of Congress want to be members of Congress so that they will compete with the president. Let ambition counteract ambition. That seems to be let the low counteract the low to produce the good. How does that happen? But isn't relying on ambition and he says, a reflection on human nature. Aren't we relying, excuse me, aren't we saying that human beings are sort of naughty people? Let the low stuff guide the low stuff. But, adds Madison, what is government itself but the greatest reflection on human nature? He says, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. So we do understand from Madison's point of view why government is necessary. Human beings, the nature of human beings is not angelic. And he goes on, and if angels were to govern, no external or internal checks would be necessary, because angels don't need any check and balancing. But human nature is not the same as angelic nature. Thus, what do we do? The answer is we have to be able to realize that while human beings are not angels, human beings are not beasts. And this requires us to make this fundamental distinction. Hello, Mrs. Licata. Hello. How are you doing? Good to see you. Good to see you. Yeah. So this requires us to understand that while human beings are fallen creatures, they are capable of being still higher than mere animals. They are not capable of being angels, but they are capable of being humans. What is it that angels have and don't have? Angels have souls but no body. What do beasts have, according to this model? Bodies but no souls. What do humans have? Bodies that get them into trouble and souls that can get them out of it. And that's the problem with human nature. So what do we do? And I think here's what I will close on to and get your questions and thoughts on this human nature. If faction is sown in the nature of man, human beings are not angels. But I would offer that if human beings are completely animals, then free government is not possible. Free government depends on the ability that human beings, however flawed, however fallen we are still capable within a range of activities of governing ourselves, or can be taught to govern ourselves, or can be raised by our families to govern ourselves. I can't govern myself with regard to, say, how to make a nuclear bomb, but apparently terrorists can. I can't, there are certain things I just don't know enough. But one would hope that I would know that there are certain products and activities which aren't good for me, and certain products and activities which are better for me. And in making that choice, I'm governing myself. And I would say that the challenge to creating a government, self-government, is understanding that humans are fallen but capable. And that's the point to this Federalist 10 and 51 in this first session. So now the floor is open for us to have a chat about human nature. and then we'll take a break, and I will introduce the next session, our two guests. Yes, go ahead. You've traveled a long way, sir. Can you imagine? He traveled all the way from Oakland for this.
Actually, Modesto. How did the collaboration come together between Madison, Jay, and Hamilton? I mean, why did they get together? And just give us a real quick background of what brought the three of them together, and how did they decide to attack the essays that were out there?
I think your operative word is quick. The three of them were in New York, so they were capable of fairly quick communication with each other. They knew they had to pour these things out. Jay was a prominent politician in New York, but he did not attend the Constitutional Convention, but he's a very, very prominent pro-Constitution person, and had the respect of Hamilton. Hamilton was the mover and shaker behind these essays, and had actually begun writing pro-constitutional essays as Caesar. Hamilton was the scrapper, right? Madison was the level-headed. Why was he in New York during this period? Because we still had a government which was based in New York, even though the convention met in Philadelphia to propose a different government. So Madison was, like a number of people, was simultaneously a member of the convention in Philadelphia to alter the government, and a member of the very government itself under the Confederation that was operating in New York. So until the new Constitution was ratified, the old government was still in operation. So Madison was in New York as a delegate from Virginia in the old government. So all three were in New York. So it wasn't like Madison writing from Virginia, etc. All right? So that's the first thing, how they got together. They were all in New York. Also, I think it's important to notice that Federalist 63 was the last Federalist paper that Madison wrote. Everything after that, one by Jay, but everything else by Hamilton. Why? Because Patrick Henry had managed to pass a rule in Virginia that you had to be a resident of Virginia to be elected to the Virginia Ratifying Convention, which took place in June. Madison was in New York, so he had to leave New York, come and reestablish his residence in Virginia in order to be eligible to run to become a delegate at the Virginia Ratifying Convention. That's point number two. So why, then how did they manage to collaborate it out? Hamilton was at the Constitutional Convention less than half the time. So he really, although Hamilton has the, shall we say, the fortitude to write something about which he knows very little. But Madison wrote all his essays, 37 through 51, because he was at the convention taking notes and understood what went on. So that wasn't quite that difficult. He could just summarize exactly what he thought the great difficulty was, leaving sort of the punch to Hamilton. So again, they didn't have to meet every night to discuss things. And finally, in this quick summary that you want, they all three agreed that they had to do something. They wanted to talk about these 5 points, but they didn't know for how long. And it depended on how, I mean, Hamilton thought 15 to 17 essays would do it. And it turns out that the Anti-Federalists simply would not go away. So if the Anti-Federalists did not go away, the opposition didn't go away, you're going to have to write more essays. So that's how it lasted 84 rather than 15 or 17. That's a quick answer to your question. Yes?
Was the real crowbar in this whole thing their fear of not having a federation that held together? I mean, basically because of France and Great Britain and even Spain? Or did that really even work into the thought process? Did they use that as kind of a hammer to push action?
Well, the answer is yes. as I've suggested before, in most of these explanations of life, there's a high ground and a low ground. The low ground rhetoric is Hamilton's way of putting it. That is, if you don't vote for this Constitution, you're in fact voting for disunion. So that's the hammer or the sickle or whatever it was that the imagery that you used. Yeah, it's saying, you could see it today. If you don't vote for Obamacare, then what you're actually voting for is people dying in the streets, right? Or if you, this sort of crisis, we're on the edge of a cliff, this sort of messianic way of describing things. So yes, part of the American rhetoric of persuasion from the very beginning has been, do you know how great the difficulty and crisis we're in? So Hamilton is particularly good at that. So yes, a vote against this Constitution is a vote for disunion. You disunionist, you secessionist, you. Yes. But on the other hand, I think that they realized that a union that was not together strong enough could become very similar to Europe and become the battleground. And we have to remember that, I think you are pointing it out, and so I'm not saying you're lacking the memory, you're pointing out to us, which we all need to remember, is that back in 1787, Britain was in Canada to the north, France, Spain was to the west, in Louisiana, right? Spain was in Florida, and so it was confined. So there was a sort of a natural pro-union way of Americanizing America, so to speak. And then you get the 1803 Louisiana Purchase, you get, before that, the Northwest Territories, which was a remarkable act, where instead of fighting each other over this land, the 13 states cooperated with each other over this land to become sort of an extended America rather than extended Massachusetts or Virginia. So foreign policy, the answer is yes. Yes, if America is disunited or divided or weak internally, then we become the playground for Europe, particularly given the contemporary geographical contour of America. So I think that once one accepts that, then it's not too far away to the Monroe Doctrine. That is, this is America's hemisphere, 1787 Northwest Ordinance, 1803 Louisiana Purchase, 1817 Florida. Keep out, this is American territory, and then you can extend it into acquiring from Mexico. And then you get a crisis in the 1880s, 1890s, in which I think that the American mind changes and in some way, and that is that the danger to America doesn't simply come from Europe and from providing the Monroe Doctrine to defend ourselves, keep out, but somehow we have to go into the world in order to defend America. Philippines, Hawaii, Cuba, etc. So a different understanding, but I don't want to go too far, but I want to just answer your question. Have I?
Well, I was thinking more.
The answer is no, I haven't answered your question.
I liked what you had, but the thing I'm thinking about is the fear of an indomitable foe. I mean, we reverted back to that during the Cold War. By having an indomitable foe, we kind of pull together a little bit more than when we don't have something we
yes,
fear.
we do. Yes, we do. Part of the problem of the late 1790s was, as usual, France and Britain were squabbling with each other. So does America get involved in that squabble between France and Britain? After all, quote, our culture is British, but the French helped us. So what do we owe our allies? And Washington said, stay neutral. But it's not easy to stay neutral when Britain and foreign policy has a domestic side to it. And by the way, lots of folks have disagreed over the importance of the War of 1812. Madison is not a warlike person, and yet he thought the War of 1812 was very important. Why? Because he saw that as sort of the final gasp of Britain to take back America. And so it's been described by a lot of historians as Mr. Madison's war, a war that was imbecilic. We could have avoided it. And once the word war comes in, we get two interpretations. This war was necessary, or got a number of interpretations. This war was necessary. This war was inevitable. This war was unavoidable. This war was stupid. I mean, so we get these historians. I mean, you know what happened, the interpretation of the Civil War? Civil War was necessary, such and such, we spilt the blood. Once Vietnam started, there were all kinds of revisionist historians who said, well, what does war settle? And by the way, what did the Civil War settle? And certainly World War I, was that a necessary war? Was that such and such? Oh, it was a war to end all wars. So how one interprets war is, that's the best answer I can give. Madison, by the way, in Federalist 45 says, the power of the state, of the federal government are few and defined. The power of the state governments are many and ill-defined. And therefore, I don't understand why you anti-federalists are so concerned that the state governments are going to be flushed down the Potomac. That's not the way this system is built. In the second paragraph, of course, all of this depends on the fact that we keep out of war. Because as soon as war starts, or is close, we have to go into debt. And if we go into debt, and we have to centralize power, the presidency is going to increase in clout, down goes the states in authority, up goes the debt. So let me tell you something, there's a certain relationship between the strengths of the states and keeping out of foreign war. And I think that, experience indicates this. Every time there's a war, and the problem is the metaphor of war is now used so often. War, not on World War I, World War II, we have Cold War, we have drug war, we have a war on dumb children, a war on fat people, we have a war on everything. So once you use the word war, then power is going to go away from the states to the general government, from within the branches to the presidency. I mean, there's a sort of that would be a Madisonian analysis of human nature and institutions. Tony, where are you? Should we take a 5-minute break?
Yes.
5-minute break.
5 minutes.
All right, because we want to end about 3.